welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am your host, Jessica, and I am here with the author of Trust Her, which is a very fast-paced thriller that deals with family and spies, and it's just really like one of those books that you absolutely cannot put down. And I did not actually realize it was a sequel until after I finished it. So that was actually amazing, because it wasn't like one of those situations where I felt like I was dropped into the middle of a book and I didn't know what was going on. I felt like I was living it with the characters. So welcome, Flynn Berry. Tell us about Trust Her.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm so glad to be here. And I'm so glad also that you were able to read it on its own. That was my hope, was that it would be a sort of sister book to my last book, Northern Spy, and that, like siblings, they would be related, they would have a lot in common, but they would also be their own people. So Trust Her is about two sisters, Tessa and Marian, and their lives in Dublin and their entanglement with the IRA and the security service MI5.
So, like I said, this is a sequel, but you don't necessarily need to read it as such. However, I will ask, did you always know that Northern Spy was going to have a sequel? But when you finished it, did you know that you weren't done with Tessa and Marian? And did this story emerge right away, or did you sort of sit with it for a bit before it came to be?
Yeah, so I had never written a sequel before, and I hadn't been planning on doing so. But then when I turned in Northern Spy to my editor, I felt this huge sense of loss, which is odd. Normally when I finish a book, I'm sort of relieved and I get to get back to my normal life and I get to see friends and maybe go for a jog or get my house in order, and all of the sort of mess that's accumulated over the course of writing the book can kind of be dealt with. But with this one, I just felt like I had been sort of exiled too soon and I didn't want to leave the world of the book. And I kept starting other projects, and I would get maybe 5 or 10 pages into a new story, and then Tessa would just kind of nudge her way onto the page and show up again. So I finally decided to give her a scene of her own, and I wrote the scene which became the first chapter in the book, where she's driving through a wheat field. And then I just wanted to follow her and to find out what would happen next, what the next scene would be, and to keep writing. And it felt like I had thought her story was finished after Northern Spy, but then it occurred to me that there was this whole other crisis ahead for her, and that I had also sort of shied away from certain things in Northern Spy, like certain parts of her relationship with her sister and her handler, and I wanted to really push those tensions even further.
So it's not really a spoiler to say, because it's pretty much written on the side of the book, the back of the book, that this takes place about how many years after Northern Spy? About 3 to 4 years after Northern Spy. And Tessa is brought back into this web where somebody from her past is trying to compromise her handler. So Eamonn is her handler, and she has to get back in touch with him because some people from her past, from the IRA, would like to compromise him. And it's really very tense, especially because she is so much defining herself as Finn's mom at this point. She has this son, he's 4, and she would like to get back to him in her, he's with her ex, and she would like to get back to Finn. And this thing happens and she doesn't know whether or not she's going to be able to even get out of it at that point. And immediately you're just kind of dropped into her body and the pace just does not stop from there. So really, the book in itself is about just trust, because both Tessa and Marian have kind of worked for two different sides of opposing agencies for different reasons. And Tessa does not want to, leave Finn without his mom. So she needs to figure out how this is all going to work and how she is going to figure this together so she can get back to that life. And there are so many factors and family situations that pull at her, including whether or not she can actually trust her sister. But that particular phrase comes up in a few other scenarios throughout the book, who you can trust. How was this book different to write than Northern Spy? And what about this type of story really drew you in? Like about the Northern Ireland and the UK and just the entire conflict, which, I mean, I remember hearing more about when I was a child. You don't hear as much about it now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good question. I think I'm really obsessed with espionage and how it works and plays with people's ideas of their identity and their loyalties and what kind of risks they'll take or not take. And in my research for Northern Spy, I had read a lot about people within the IRA being turned into informers working for the British. And at one point, I think there was a figure that something like 1 in 3 IRA members was actually working for the British secretly. But I hadn't ever heard anything about a member of MI5 being turned by the IRA and becoming an informer in their own right. And I thought that would be such an interesting challenge to give Tessa, to see how do you possibly convince someone from this organization that's very powerful and very kind of cohesive to switch over to another side, to do something that's very dangerous and to take that risk. And I never outlined my book, so I had no idea how she was going to do it, or if she would do it, or how she would even approach it either. And it was really fun to be in her shoes and try to sort of work through the problem with her. I'm so glad you said that you felt like you were in her body, because I think as a writer, I'm constantly doing a kind of like method acting where I'm imagining what sensation is she actually feeling in this exact moment? What is it like to go swimming in really cold water, which she does several times, or to have a kind of fear that she has that's really sudden. And just, I'm constantly sitting at my desk kind of, tensing my body or moving my arms in different ways and trying to get the gestures right. So I'm so glad that you felt that way as a reader.
That's really cool. I always love hearing just about how writers put things together. Were you ever in Tessa's body then and really stumped for an out? You don't have to give any spoilers, but did it kind of keep you up at night a few times? Like you as Tessa were stuck and you just were really, I suppose, looking at the set dressing, trying to figure out how she was going to maneuver herself away from this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. No one's ever asked me that before, but it is really interesting as a writer when you get sort of into the middle of the book and you think, okay, what's actually going on here? How do we move forward? And what will she do next? And it's almost like, as a writer, your heroine is someone who you tend to adore and you like the person, and then just horrible things keep happening to them. And it definitely felt like I was going through that alongside her. And like it was also very cathartic for me to write, because it was a way to take all of my kind of worst fears as a parent and play with them on the page and try to work out that kind of threat and protectiveness and vigilance that I feel as a parent all the time. And I know other parents do too.
It was very effective. That's all I'm going to say. Did you have a favorite character in particular? Like, are you partial to Tessa or Marian, or perhaps one of the other figures that come into it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Tessa at this point is just a real person to me who I can picture just going about her daily life in Dublin. And I can see her as though she's sort of standing next to me at the playground. And it's almost like I know her so well at this point that I can get irritated with her or frustrated with her, and also just really enjoy her company. Like I found it very kind of companionable to be writing about her for the past 6 years. And then I'd say my favorite secondary character turned out to be Eamonn, her handler in the book, because he was so much fun to write and he kept surprising me on the page and doing things I hadn't planned out for him, which is the best kind of character. It's really fun when you get a character in a room and you start writing their dialogue and then suddenly they say something completely unexpected and that shifts the story in such a different direction.
I really liked Eamon too. Would you ever write more about him in particular, or would you keep him as sort of a side character?
That's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, the problem with uh, these books in general is that I could easily write them for the rest of my life. Like I could take any character from the book. There's one who's a makeup artist at the BBC in Belfast named Colette, who I would love to write a full novel about. There's also a politician named Rebecca Main, who I could see having her own book. And absolutely, Eamon would be so much fun to write his story. Um, right now, I've sort of said goodbye to them because I'm working on a different project, but I can imagine coming back to it at some point.
So, what kind of books do you like to read when you consume books? Are you reading thrillers, or do you kind of take a break from this genre?
Yeah, no, I read pretty widely. I love thrillers. I love mysteries. I love classic old mysteries. I also love reading, new releases every month, and then I also read sort of literary fiction about family dynamics and coming of age stories. Um, the book I'm reading currently is called Service by Sarah Gilmartin, and it's about a young woman who is working at a restaurant in Dublin during the Celtic Tiger years, and her head chef is accused of a crime, and it's really good. And I think that might be my sort of absolute favorite type of book where you have these elements of crime or suspense or psychological kind of unease, and then there's also uh, a whole other thread, which in this case is the restaurant and the kind of boom years in Dublin.
Well, that sounds pretty great. And it actually leads me to my next question. Your connection to Celtic culture and Dublin do you have family from there? And also, do you speak Gaelic? Because you pepper your books with it. Tessa had all of the sweet words that she called her son Finn, just different Gaelic, Irish endearments. And it was really sweet. And it added so much to just the tapestry of the story. So, what about you?
I'm so glad that you like that. Yeah, there are a few endearments that mean sort of my heart, which I adore and I use in my head constantly. I don't speak Gaelic. I would love to, and I actually thought about teaching it or learning it or taking a class while I was writing the book. But then there's so much research that you can do when you're writing about Ireland and Northern Ireland and the Troubles that it felt like there were all of these books I wanted to be reading and documentaries I wanted to watch, and I never actually got down to the Gaelic yet. I just find the language really fascinating. I also find the cadence really beautiful. On my first visit to Dublin, was on a train coming back from Dalkey, and there was a man behind me who was just describing what he had bought for food to someone on the other end of the phone, and just describing the contents of his shopping bag was so lyrical. Like it sounded like a poem. It was gorgeous. And I just remember sitting on the train and thinking, like, I want to do this in writing somehow. And I was very nervous about getting it wrong because obviously I'm American. And so the way I tried to get around that was to listen constantly to Irish voices, like listening to podcasts or to stand-up comedy or to comedian panel shows or to documentaries and trying to really get the timbre right.
It's funny because I've been to Ireland a number of times, and I find it amazing. You know, you go to certain places and sometimes the signs are in English and Gaelic, and then there are places where it's just Gaelic, and even the TV, they take it very seriously. You know, sometimes locals dub other shows in Gaelic. So I think my favorite story was that I was in Galway, and my boyfriend at the time, husband and I turned on the Gaelic channel because we were interested in it. We were staying at a B&B, and our host told us about this, and we said, oh, okay, let's listen, because she had mentioned that the schools really try to keep the language alive, that most kids, you know, they'll go to a school to learn Gaelic themselves. And we caught a commercial for South Park in Gaelic, and it was the strangest thing ever to hear somebody try to do those voices in Gaelic.
Mm-hmm. That would be a fun job. There's a poet I really like named Doreen Ní Grioffa who writes in Gaelic and in English, and some of her books of poems come with the poems in both Gaelic and English. And her writing is extraordinary. She wrote a book called A Ghost in the Throat that has a lot of kind of Gaelic terms I really loved reading.
Well, this was, again, a great book. It is, as I mentioned, breakneck pace. I don't blame you for wanting to revisit this world because it was so rich and the characters are just really good. So if you have not read Northern Spy yet, you can read them both. You can read both Northern Spy and Trust Her, or you could just read Trust Her. I wouldn't read them in that order though, because obviously Trust Her will spoil Northern Spy for you. But they really, this book was just, I not for a minute felt like I missed out on anything. I think my last thing I just wanted to know was there a huge difference that you found in writing this one versus the first?
Yeah, I think one big difference was that I had 2 kids instead of 1, and so the scheduling of the writing was different, and it felt really good though to still have that through line and to have had something that I started before I became a parent that I could still go back to. So that was one difference, and then I think the other difference was that it felt almost like I was able to play with the plot more in this book and Trust Her because I knew the characters already so well. And so, whereas Northern Spy, I spent a lot of time in the drafting figuring out who the characters were and what their relationships were and what the world was. With this one, I felt like I knew all of them. And then I was more curious about how many kind of twists and turns the story could take.
Thank you so much, Flynn Berry. This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast, and we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.